The morning the Duke of Ashcombe collapsed, the sky above the wolds was the color of cold ash. It had been a fine November hunt, the kind that drew every gentleman within 20 miles of Ashcombe Manor. Horses steamed in the early frost, hounds bayed across the frozen meadows, and red-coated riders moved through the bare oak trees like drops of blood on a white canvas. The Duke rode at the front, as he always did. He was that sort of man, the kind who led without thinking about it, who never checked whether anyone followed, because they always did. His name was Edmund Ashcombe, 5th Duke of Ashcombe, and at 43 he remained broad-shouldered and sharp-eyed, with the kind of weathered, serious face that made younger men straighten their backs without being asked. He had managed his estate for nearly 2 decades, kept his tenants fed through bad harvests, and buried both his parents without shedding a public tear. Nobody in the county questioned his strength, least of all himself. Which is perhaps why what happened next shocked the entire county so completely. It was young Thomas Croft, the stable master's eldest boy, who first saw the Duke sway in the saddle. One moment he was urging his gray stallion across a frost-hardened ditch, and the next he simply dropped. No cry, no warning. He fell sideways and hit the frozen earth with a dull, terrible sound that silenced every hound within earshot. They carried him home on a hastily constructed stretcher of hunting coats and broken fence rails, 6 men bearing him across the fields while the Duchess, Eleanor, a composed woman of 38, stood on the front steps of Ashcombe Manor and watched them come with a face that showed nothing. Those who knew her well understood that Eleanor Ashcombe's stillness was not coldness. It was the particular stillness of a woman who has learned to hold herself together by sheer force of will, because if she does not, everything will fall apart. Dr. Fenwick arrived within the hour, summoned by fast horse from the village of Thornwick. He examined the Duke at length, pressing fingers to pulse points, lifting eyelids, tapping joints with quiet deliberation. When he finally descended the oak staircase to the hall where the Duchess waited, his face told her very little. "He breathes steadily," Fenwick said carefully. "The heart is sound, but he does not wake, and I cannot say when, or whether, he will." Eleanor received this in silence. Then she went upstairs to sit beside her husband, took his hand in hers, and did not leave. What nobody in that house knew, what nobody could have suspected, was that the Duke was perfectly awake. He lay in his great 4-poster bed, beneath wool blankets and a heavy counterpane, and he heard everything. He heard his wife's breathing beside him, slow and controlled. He heard the servants whispering beyond the door, and beneath all of it, like a splinter working its way deeper, he heard the words that had reached him on the hunting field just before he fell. A fragment of conversation between 2 voices he recognized, drifting across the frosted hedgerow at precisely the wrong moment. When the old Duke goes, everything changes. We need only be patient. He had recognized one of the voices immediately, his cousin, Reginald Ashcombe, who had ridden up from Somerset with 3 traveling trunks and a new black waistcoat that had clearly been purchased in anticipation of something. The other voice he could not place with certainty, only that it was low, educated, and unhurried, the voice of a man who had already decided how events would unfold. The shock of those words had done something to him. Combined with the cold, the exertion of the hunt, and a sharp pain behind his left eye that had been troubling him for a fortnight, they had brought him down. Fenwick, who was a thorough and honest physician, had concluded accurately enough that the Duke had suffered some form of neurological episode, a sudden overwhelming shock to the system. What Fenwick had not concluded, because it was not medically possible to conclude it, was that Edmund Ashcombe had recovered consciousness within 6 hours of being put to bed and had made a decision. He would not wake up. Not yet. He had spent 2 decades managing an estate, reading contracts, weighing loyalties, and watching men perform generosity while counting what they stood to gain from it. He knew, with the cold clarity that had always defined him, that a man lying helpless in his bed would hear the truth more completely than a man sitting upright at his own table. People were careful around power. They were careless around weakness. So he lay still. He controlled his breathing. He kept his eyes closed and his hands loose, and he listened. By the time the household had assembled itself into its new, hushed, grief-adjacent routine, he had already heard enough to understand that his house contained people who wished him well and people who were simply waiting. The difficulty was telling them apart. He was not certain about Eleanor. That uncertainty sat in his chest like a stone. He had overheard her speaking in low, urgent tones to the coachman about a journey to York, something about solicitors, something about accounts. She had not mentioned it to anyone else in the household, which meant either she had perfectly ordinary reasons for the secrecy, or she did not. He told himself he was being rational. He told himself any man in his position would want to know. In the corridor outside his chamber, footsteps paused briefly near his door each evening around 7:30. Light, unhurried footsteps, not the Duchess, who moved with a brisker step, and not the upstairs housemaid, whose boots were loose and scuffed and made a distinctive dragging sound on the floorboards. These footsteps stopped, waited perhaps 10 seconds, and then continued. On the 3rd evening, the Duke risked opening his eyes a fraction. Standing just inside the doorway, candle in hand, was the young parlour maid, Mary. She was perhaps 20, slight and brown-haired, dressed in the plain dark wool of the household staff. She was not looking at him with the mournful, half-curious expression the other servants wore when they came in to change the water or bring fresh linen. She was watching his hands. The Duke closed his eyes again, very slowly, and for the first time since he had made his decision, he felt something close to uncertainty. Because the expression on that young maid's face had not been grief, or curiosity, or even suspicion. It had been the careful, measuring look of someone who already knew. Ashcombe Manor changed in the way that great houses always change when death hovers near without quite arriving, slowly, and then all at once. The first to appear were the relatives. Reginald Ashcombe came down from Somerset within 2 days, which was impressively fast for a man who claimed to have received the news only that morning. He was the Duke's first cousin, 45 years old, with the soft hands of a man who had never managed anything larger than his own quarterly allowance. He wore a black wool frock coat that was slightly too well fitted to have been made in a hurry, and he moved through the manor's reception rooms with the quiet, proprietary air of someone mentally measuring the curtains. Behind him came others. A second cousin from Edinburgh, a widowed aunt from Bath who arrived with 2 trunks and a lapdog, and a pair of brothers from Northumberland, whose connection to the Duke was distant enough that nobody could immediately recall the precise details. They assembled in the drawing rooms and spoke in hushed, respectful tones about the Duke's health, and when they thought nobody was listening, they spoke about other things entirely. Mary moved through all of it with a coal scuttle and a feather duster, and she heard everything. This was the particular invisibility of service, the understanding that a maid carrying linen down a corridor was, to most people of quality, approximately as noticeable as the corridor itself. The relatives talked freely around her, the way they talked freely around the furniture. She heard Reginald Ashcombe tell the Edinburgh cousin that the estate's eastern farmlands alone were worth more than most men in the county would see in 3 generations. She heard the Northumberland brothers debate whether the Duchess had any legal standing to contest a provisional inheritance arrangement should the Duke be declared permanently incapacitated. She heard the widowed aunt from Bath say, with a sigh that contained rather more satisfaction than sorrow, that Eleanor had always been a cold woman and that the Duke deserved better. None of this surprised Mary especially. She had been in service since she was 14, and she had learned early that wealth did not improve people so much as it simply gave them more room to be exactly what they already were. What did surprise her was the Duchess. Eleanor Ashcombe had not left her husband's side for the first 36 hours. She had slept in the chair beside his bed, refused meals until the housekeeper physically brought a tray and stood over her while she ate, and had spoken to the assembled relatives with a courtesy so precisely measured that it communicated, to anyone paying attention, that she found their presence somewhere between unnecessary and offensive. She was not, by any observable measure, a woman scheming to claim her husband's fortune. She was a woman who appeared to be quietly holding herself together with considerable effort, and yet, on the fourth day, she summoned the coachman before breakfast and left the manor in the closed carriage without telling anyone where she was going. She returned after dark. On the fifth day, she did the same. By the sixth, the servants' hall had generated 3 separate theories about these journeys, each one less charitable than the last, and the relatives had begun mentioning them in drawing-room conversation with the studied casualness of people who want a rumor to travel without appearing to carry it themselves. Mary said nothing. She changed bed linens, polished silver, and carried coal, and she watched. It was on the 5th evening, during her regular check of the Duke's chamber, that the thing happened which confirmed what she had already begun to suspect. She was straightening the counterpane on the far side of the bed, working quietly in the low light of a single oil lamp, when her hand brushed the Duke's. She moved to draw back, and felt, with absolute clarity, his fingers close briefly around hers. Not a spasm, not the involuntary twitch that Dr. Fenwick occasionally noted in unconscious patients. A deliberate, controlled squeeze, lasting perhaps 2 seconds, and then released. She did not gasp. She did not step back. She continued smoothing the counterpane with her free hand, as though nothing had occurred, finished her work on that side of the bed, and moved to the window to check the latch against the night cold. When she turned back, the Duke lay exactly as he always did, eyes closed, chest rising and falling in the slow, undisturbed rhythm that had convinced everyone from Fenwick to the Edinburgh cousin that he was beyond knowing anything at all. Mary picked up her lamp, dropped a small curtsy toward the bed, out of habit, and left the room. In the corridor, she stood still for a moment in the dark and breathed carefully. She had 2 choices. She could go to Dr. Fenwick tonight and tell him what she had felt, and the whole performance would be over before morning. The relatives would disperse, the Duke would explain himself, and life at Ashcombe Manor would return to whatever it had been before. She thought about Reginald Ashcombe and his well-fitted black coat. She thought about the Northumberland brothers quietly discussing inheritance law in a house where the owner was still breathing. Then she went downstairs, banked the kitchen fire for the night, and said nothing to anyone. The 7th day brought frost thick enough to crack the stone birdbath in the manor garden, and with it came a shift in the atmosphere of Ashcombe Manor that even the least perceptive visitor could not have missed. Reginald Ashcombe had stopped pretending to grieve. He still wore the black coat, and he still spoke about his cousin's condition with appropriate gravity when the physician was present, but in the hours between, he had begun conducting himself less like a mourning relative and more like a man who had already inherited something and was quietly getting on with managing it. He took breakfast at the head of the dining table 3 mornings, running without anyone challenging him. He sent one of his own servants to the estate office to request copies of the tenant ledgers, citing a vague concern about whether the accounts were being properly maintained in the Duke's absence. The estate steward, a cautious man named Briggs, who had served the Ashcombe family for 20 years, handed nothing over, and sent a polite but firm note back in return. Reginald received this note at the breakfast table, read it twice, and smiled in a way that Mary, pouring coffee at the sideboard, found considerably more unsettling than anger would have been. That same morning the Duchess left again for York. This time she was gone longer, returning well after supper had been cleared, stepping down from the carriage in the lamplit courtyard with a leather satchel tucked under her arm that she carried upstairs herself, rather than handing to the footman. She looked tired in a way that went beyond the ordinary exhaustion of travel. There were shadows beneath her eyes that had not been there a fortnight ago, and the particular tightness around her mouth that Mary had come to recognize as Eleanor Ashcombe's version of distress. The satchel went into the Duchess's private sitting room, and the door was locked. By the following morning, the servants' hall had settled on its preferred explanation. Mrs. Holt, the cook, stated with considerable authority that the Duchess was visiting solicitors in York to arrange the transfer of the Duke's accounts into her own name before he was formally declared incapacitated. The laundry maid agreed with enthusiasm. The footman, James, added that he had heard from the coachman that the Duchess had visited the same address on 3 separate occasions now, and that the building in question belonged to a firm of lawyers whose speciality was estate management. This information reached the drawing room by the afternoon, carried there by no single person, and yet arriving with the efficiency of something everyone had been waiting to hear. Reginald Ashcombe listened to it with his hands folded across his waistcoat and an expression of practiced sorrow. "One hopes," he said to the Edinburgh cousin, "that Eleanor's intentions are entirely proper. One simply cannot be certain, given the circumstances." The Edinburgh cousin nodded gravely, as though this were a conclusion he had reached independently. Upstairs in his chamber, the Duke heard every word of it, repeated by the housemaid, who came to refresh the water jug, who was not repeating it maliciously, but simply could not help herself, because the story was too large for the servants' hall to contain. Mary, passing in the corridor with an armful of pressed linen, heard the housemaid's voice through the partly open door, and felt something tighten in her chest. She had not yet told anyone what she knew. The Duke was conscious. The household was fracturing along its fault lines, and the Duchess, who had, as far as Mary could observe, done nothing except travel in secret and return looking exhausted, was being quietly dismantled by people who had arrived, wearing mourning clothes they had purchased in advance. That evening, Mary did something she had never done in 4 years of service at Ashcombe Manor. She followed Reginald Ashcombe. She had no plan beyond simple observation. He had taken to walking the Manor's east corridor after dinner, which struck her as unusual, given that the east corridor contained nothing except the estate office, the Duke's private study, and a large window that looked out over the stable yard. There was no reason for a guest to favor that particular corridor unless the guest was interested in what those rooms contained. She followed him at a distance, keeping to the unlit side of the passage with the ease of someone who had carried candles through dark corridors for years and knew exactly where each floorboard creaked. He stopped outside the Duke's study, tried the door handle, found it locked. Briggs had seen to that, and stood for a moment with his hand still on the brass handle, perfectly motionless. Then he turned and walked back toward the main staircase without hurrying, and Mary pressed herself into the shadow of a window recess and let him pass within 4 feet of her. He was humming quietly to himself. A hymn, she realized, something slow and solemn. She waited until his footsteps had descended the stairs entirely, then stood in the dark corridor for a long moment, thinking. The Duchess was traveling to York in secret. That was the fact everyone had seized upon and was busy turning into a story that suited them. But Reginald Ashcombe was trying doors he had no right to try, in a wing of the house he had no reason to visit, and humming hymns to himself in the dark. Mary thought those 2 facts ought to be considered together. Nobody else in Ashcombe Manor appeared to be considering them at all. It was Mary herself who suggested the journey to London. She did not do it boldly or directly. That was not the way things worked between a parlour maid and a duchess, and Mary understood the architecture of her position well enough to know that a direct suggestion would be received as impertinence at best. Instead, she waited until the Duchess was sitting alone in her private parlour on a grey Tuesday morning, writing letters with the concentrated stillness of someone who is using work to hold grief at bay, and Mary mentioned, while setting fresh coals on the fire, that she had a small personal errand in London if any occasion arose to travel that way, a matter concerning a parcel left with her late mother's landlady in Southwark, nothing of consequence. Eleanor Ashcombe looked up from her letters with the distracted expression of a woman whose thoughts are in 3 places simultaneously. "I am travelling to London myself on Thursday," she said, after a moment. "You may come as attendant if Mrs. Holt can spare you." Mrs. Holt could not spare her, and said so at some length. Mary went anyway. The journey south took the better part of 2 days by closed carriage, stopping overnight at a coaching inn outside Northampton, where the ceilings were low and the beds were not. The Duchess barely spoke during the journey, which suited Mary well enough because silence gave her room to watch. Eleanor sat with her leather satchel on the seat beside her, rather than in the luggage box with the trunks, and twice during the journey she opened it, read something inside, and closed it again without showing Mary the contents. They arrived in London on Friday morning, taking rooms in a quiet lodging house near Westminster, recommended by the family solicitor, a Mr. Aldous Pemberton of Gray's Inn. It was a respectable establishment, narrow-fronted and well-curtained, of the kind that catered to people who wished to conduct their business in the city without attracting attention. The Duchess told Mary to rest after the journey, which Mary did for approximately 40 minutes before she put on her wool cloak and went quietly downstairs. She had no particular plan. She told herself she was simply walking, taking in the grey November air of the city streets, the clatter of carriage wheels on wet cobblestones, the smell of coal smoke and roasting chestnuts from a barrow at the corner. London in November was not a comfortable place, but it was a useful one, full of people moving quickly with their collars up, paying no attention to anyone else. She had noted, on arriving, that the lodging house had a small reading room off the entrance hall, separated from the main corridor by a door with a panel of frosted glass. She had also noted that this room shared a wall with a private meeting parlour, and that the connecting wall was thin enough, old plasterwork over timber framing, to be, in quiet moments, somewhat less than entirely soundproof. She had not planned to use this information. It simply seemed worth knowing. On the second morning of their stay, the Duchess rose early and sent a note. Her visitor arrived at 9:30, a small, precise man in a grey coat whom Mary recognized from his previous correspondence with the estate as Mr. Pemberton himself. He was shown into the private parlour, and the door was closed. Mary was in the reading room, ostensibly mending a tear in one of the Duchess's travelling gloves. The wall between them was every bit as thin as she had calculated. She could not hear every word. Voices dropped at crucial moments, and the street outside occasionally swelled with the noise of passing carts. But she heard enough. She heard enough to sit very still, with the glove forgotten in her lap and her needle suspended in mid-air, because what she was hearing dismantled, piece by piece, every theory that had been carefully constructed back at Ashcombe Manor over the past 2 weeks. The Duchess was not claiming the estate. She was not transferring the Duke's accounts, or securing his assets, or doing any of the things that Reginald Ashcombe had been so diligently suggesting to anyone who would listen. She was selling her jewelry. Not the Ashcombe pieces. Those belonged to the estate and could not be touched. Her own jewelry, the pieces she had brought to the marriage as part of her personal dowry, a collection of sapphire and pearl pieces inherited from her own mother, and a diamond brooch her father had given her on her wedding morning. She was instructing Pemberton to arrange their quiet sale through a reputable London dealer, and she was doing it because the estate carried debts. Old debts, accumulated by the late Duke before Edmund had inherited, that were now approaching a point where the tenant farmers on the eastern holdings would begin to feel the consequences. She did not want Edmund to know. That was the part that Mary heard most clearly, because the Duchess's voice rose slightly on that point, with a conviction that came through the old plaster wall without any difficulty at all. She did not want him to wake, if he woke, to the knowledge that his father had left the estate compromised, and that his tenants had nearly lost their farms while he lay unconscious and unknowing. Mary set down the glove. She looked at the frosted glass panel in the door across the room, and behind it, the shadowed shape of the corridor beyond. The Duke, lying in his great bed at Ashcombe Manor, had spent 2 weeks doubting his wife. He had doubted entirely the wrong person. They returned to Ashcombe Manor on a Sunday, arriving after nightfall, when the house was quiet and the stable yard was lit by a single lantern swinging in the November wind. The Duchess went directly upstairs without speaking to anyone. Mary unpacked the traveling trunks, pressed the Duchess's clothes, and sat for a long time in the small room she shared with the laundry maid, thinking about what came next. She had information that could change everything. She also had no power whatsoever. She was a parlour maid in a household full of people whose word would always, under any circumstances, carry more weight than hers. If she walked into the drawing room tomorrow morning and announced that Reginald Ashcombe was planning to defraud the estate while the Duchess quietly sold her own jewelry to protect the tenants, she would be out of the house before luncheon with a poor character reference and nowhere to go. The Duke was the only person who could change that equation. But to tell the Duke anything, she would need to wait for a moment when they were entirely alone, and in a house this full of watchful relatives, entirely alone was becoming increasingly difficult to arrange. So she waited, and while she waited, she watched Reginald. He had grown bolder since their return. Whether he had learned something during her absence, or whether the passing days simply increased his confidence, she could not say, but his behavior had shifted from the subtle to the barely concealed. He spent long hours in the billiard room with the Northumberland brothers, and their conversations stopped abruptly whenever a servant appeared in the doorway. He had begun asking Briggs pointed questions about which debts against the estate were legally attached to the title and which might be considered personal to the Duke, questions that Briggs, to his considerable credit, declined to answer and promptly recorded in writing for his own protection. On the Wednesday following their return, Mary noticed something that everyone else had apparently overlooked. Reginald's personal manservant, a lean, sharp-faced man named Goss, who had arrived with him from Somerset, had been spending his evenings not in the servants' hall with the rest of the household staff, but somewhere else entirely. Mary had noticed his absence twice at supper, and thought nothing of it. On the third evening she paid closer attention and tracked the pattern of his movements to the east corridor, the same corridor where Reginald had tried the study door 3 weeks earlier. She gave it 2 more days. On Friday evening, when the family had gathered in the drawing room after dinner and the upper servants were occupied with clearing and the lower ones with the kitchen, Mary took a candle and went to the Duke's private study. The lock had not been forced. Whoever had gained entry had done it properly, with either a key or sufficient skill to make the distinction irrelevant. The room looked undisturbed at first, books in their places, the large mahogany desk clear, the grate cold and swept. But Mary had spent 4 years learning the precise arrangement of every room in this house, because a good parlour maid knows when something has been moved and puts it back correctly, and she could see immediately that the study had been gone through with care. The ledgers on the lower shelf were a fraction out of sequence. A small stack of estate correspondence on the desk had been replaced in the wrong order. These were tiny things, the kind that nobody but a conscientious servant would ever notice, and she suspected that was precisely why nobody had. She moved to the desk and opened the lower right drawer, which stuck slightly, unless you lifted the handle at a particular angle, another thing only the household staff would know. Inside, beneath a layer of blank writing paper, her fingers found a folded document that she was quite certain had not been there before. She drew it out carefully, opened it beside her candle, and read. It took her several minutes to understand what she was looking at, because the language was legal and the handwriting small, but the substance of it became clear enough. It was a debt record, detailed, official-looking, bearing what appeared to be the seal of a London counting house, stating that the Duke had personally borrowed a substantial sum against the value of the eastern farmlands, and that in the event of his incapacitation or death, the lands could be claimed against the debt immediately. Every figure in it was false. She could not have proven that in a court of law that evening, but she knew it, because she had stood in that thin-walled reading room in Westminster and heard Eleanor Ashcombe describe the estate's actual debt position to Mr. Pemberton in precise terms, and this document described something entirely different, something designed specifically to dispossess the tenant farmers, and more importantly, to demonstrate that the Duchess had failed in her management of the estate's affairs. Mary stood in the cold study and understood the whole shape of it. This document, and presumably others like it, were being positioned to surface at exactly the right moment. The moment when the Duke was declared beyond recovery, and the question of who managed Ashcombe Manor became formally urgent. She folded the paper and placed it back precisely where she had found it. She straightened the ledgers, corrected the correspondence, and left the room exactly as she had entered it. She was halfway down the corridor when she heard footsteps behind her. She did not run. Running would have been the end of everything. She turned the corner at a measured pace, descended the servants' stair, and did not look back, though every instinct she possessed was screaming at her to do exactly that. Behind her, at the turn of the corridor, she heard the footsteps stop. Then, very quietly, she heard two voices begin to confer. Ravenshire Hall sat 3 miles east of Ashcombe Manor, across flat farmland that turned silver in the early winter light. And the harvest ball held there each November was the one social occasion in the county that nobody of consequence missed, regardless of personal circumstance. Bereavements were acceptable. Illness was acceptable. A duke lying in a coma at home was, apparently, not sufficient reason to withdraw entirely from the county's social fabric. And so, Eleanor Ashcombe accepted the invitation from Lord and Lady Ravenshire with the same quiet composure she brought to everything, and prepared to attend. The household spent 2 days in preparation. Gowns were aired and pressed, jewelry was laid out, carriages were polished, and the relatives assembled themselves in the entrance hall on the evening in question, with the collective energy of people who have been confined indoors too long and are grateful for an excuse to be seen. Mary dressed the Duchess herself, fastening the long row of jet buttons on Eleanor's black silk gown with fingers that were steadier than her thoughts. The Duchess had chosen to wear mourning colors, despite the occasion not technically requiring them, which Mary understood as a statement directed at the assembled relatives rather than at Lord and Lady Ravenshire. Eleanor sat at her dressing table and watched Mary's reflection in the glass with an expression that was difficult to read. "You have been very quiet since London," the Duchess said. "I am generally quiet, Your Grace," Mary replied. Eleanor looked at her a moment longer than was necessary, then returned her eyes to the glass and said nothing more. They arrived at Ravenshire Hall by carriage at 7:30, pulling into a lamplit forecourt, already crowded with vehicles and horses, and the noise of a county gathering itself for an evening's entertainment. The hall was a broad Georgian building, warm and bright, every ground-floor window throwing yellow light across the gravel, and inside it smelled of beeswax candles and pine boughs, and the particular combination of perfume and wood smoke that belonged exclusively to winter parties in large country houses. Mary slipped into the background with the ease of long practice, finding her way to the servants' corridor that ran alongside the main reception rooms, where she could move between the hall, the supper room, and the card room without crossing the principal floor. Other ladies' maids and valets occupied the same space, and she exchanged the small, efficient courtesies of their shared profession while keeping her attention fixed on the room beyond the doorway. Reginald was in fine form. He had exchanged the black coat for a dark gray one that acknowledged mourning while declining to commit to it, and he moved through the room with an ease that confirmed what Mary had suspected, that this evening was not simply social for him. He greeted neighbors, he spoke at length with two gentlemen she did not recognize, and he spent 20 minutes in apparently earnest conversation with a stout man in a brown coat who arrived late and left early, and whose face she could not quite see from her position. She moved along the servants' corridor until she reached the card-room entrance, where the angle was better. The stout man was Dr. Fenwick. Mary stood very still. Fenwick was leaning toward Reginald with the posture of a man receiving rather than delivering information, and his expression was uncomfortable in the specific way of someone being asked to do something they have not yet decided whether to do. Reginald's hand rested on the physician's arm, not gripping, just resting, the way a man rests his hand on something he intends to keep. She could not hear them above the noise of the room. She was too far away, and the musicians had begun a reel that filled the hall with enough sound to make even nearby conversation difficult. But she did not need to hear them. She had found the forged documents in the study. She had heard the Northumberland brothers discussing the legal requirements for declaring a man permanently incapacitated. She knew what was being asked. They needed Fenwick to sign a declaration, and they needed it soon, before the Duchess returned from London with whatever she had arranged with Pemberton, before Briggs found cause to contact the family's own legal representation, before anything changed. Mary left the card-room entrance and walked quickly to the end of the servants' corridor, where a young lad of about 15 was sitting on an upturned coal bucket, polishing a set of serving spoons. She recognized him. Tom Hatch, son of the Ashcombe Manor head groom, pressed into service for the evening. She crouched to his level, which was not dignified, but was considerably more effective than towering over him. "Tom," she said quietly, "I need you to take a message to Dr. Fenwick's house tonight. Not to him directly, to his housekeeper, Mrs. Gale. You know the house?" Tom nodded, eyes wide. "Tell her to give the doctor this when he returns home this evening." She pressed a folded note into his hand. She had written it during the carriage ride, uncertain whether she would need it, relieved that she had prepared it anyway. "Tell no one else. Not your father, not the other lads, nobody." Tom looked at the note, then at her face, and something in what he saw there made him ask no questions at all. He pocketed it and slipped out through the back entrance into the cold night air. Mary straightened, smoothed her apron, and went back to her position in the corridor, where the music played on, and Reginald Ashcombe laughed at something across the room with the easy confidence of a man who believes everything is proceeding exactly according to his plan. 3 days passed after the harvest ball, in a silence that had weight to it. Dr. Fenwick visited the manor each morning as he always did, checking the Duke's pulse, lifting his eyelids, making his careful notes in the small leather journal he kept in his coat pocket. He said very little to the assembled relatives, who lingered in the corridor outside the Duke's chamber hoping for news, and what he did say was sufficiently ambiguous to satisfy nobody. Reginald Ashcombe twice attempted to draw him into private conversation and was twice deflected with the professional courtesy of a man who has decided, without announcing it, which side of a line he stands on. Mary watched this and understood that her note had done its work. What the note had contained was simple. 4 sentences, no more. She had told Fenwick that she had reason to believe pressure would be brought to bear on him regarding the Duke's prognosis, that forged estate documents existed in the Duke's study, and that she intended to present everything she knew to the appropriate person within the week. She had signed it with her name and position, which took a particular kind of nerve for a parlour maid writing to a physician, and she had not allowed herself to think too carefully about the consequences before she folded it and handed it to Tom Hatch. Fenwick had said nothing to her directly. He was too careful a man for that. But on the morning after the ball he had arrived at the manor slightly earlier than usual, and before going upstairs he had stopped in the entrance hall and asked, in the hearing of 2 footmen and the housekeeper, that he not be disturbed during his examination of the Duke under any circumstances, as he wished to conduct a more thorough assessment. This announcement served no medical purpose that Mary could identify. It served an excellent practical one. It gave her a reason to be in the Duke's chamber alone, with the physician present as chaperone. She went up at 9:30, carrying fresh water and linen as she did every morning, and Fenwick, already seated beside the bed with his journal open, looked up at her and then back down at his journal and said nothing. Mary set down the water, arranged the linen on the press at the foot of the bed, and waited until she could hear that the corridor outside was quiet. Then she pulled the chair close to the Duke's bedside, sat down in a manner that was entirely improper for a parlour maid in the presence of a Duke, and spoke in a voice just above a whisper. She told him everything. She started with the night she had felt his hand close around hers, and told him she had known from that moment and had chosen to say nothing, because she believed the household needed to be understood before it could be confronted. She told him about Reginald trying the study door, about the forged debt records hidden beneath the blank paper in the lower drawer, about Goss, the sharp-faced manservant, and the evenings he spent in the East Corridor, about the Northumberland brothers and their careful conversations about inheritance law. Then she told him about London. She described the thin-walled reading room, the frosted glass panel, and the voice of his wife coming through old plaster with the particular clarity of a woman saying something she believed no one else would ever hear. She told him what the Duchess was selling and why. She told him about the sapphire pieces and the diamond brooch and the tenant farmers on the Eastern holdings, and she told him that Eleanor had specifically instructed Pemberton that the Duke was not to know, because she did not want him to wake to the knowledge of what his father had left behind. She finished speaking and sat in the chair with her hands folded in her lap and waited. For a long moment, there was no sound in the room except the fire settling in the grate and the distant movement of the household below. Then the Duke opened his eyes. It was the first time Mary had seen them open, and they were gray and they were bright, and at that particular moment they were filled with an expression she recognized, because she had seen it on the faces of people who have discovered they have been badly wrong about something they were utterly certain of. He did not speak immediately. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then at Fenwick, who met his gaze with the quiet steadiness of a man who has been waiting for this and is not surprised by it. Then he looked at Mary. "How long have you known?" His voice was rough from disuse, barely above a whisper. "Since the 5th evening, Your Grace." He closed his eyes again briefly. When he opened them, some of the initial expression had settled into something harder and more purposeful. "The documents in the study, you left them in place." "Yes, Your Grace. Moving them would have told them someone knew." He was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he looked at Fenwick. "How much time do we have before they move?" Fenwick considered. "Reginald approached me again yesterday morning. I would say days rather than weeks." The Duke looked back at the ceiling. Something shifted in his expression, not quite guilt, not quite grief, but the particular look of a man who has been handed a reckoning he knows he deserves and is choosing to face it squarely. "Then we have work to do," he said quietly. "All three of us." The invitations went out on a Thursday. Fenwick wrote them in his own hand at the Duke's direction. Careful, formal letters requesting the presence of family members, the estate solicitor, 2 neighboring landowners who served as parish magistrates, and the Ashcombe family's own legal representative, a Mr. Carthew of York, who arrived by post-chaise on the Saturday morning, looking alert in the way that lawyers look alert when they suspect something interesting is about to occur. The letters described the gathering as a meeting to discuss provisional estate arrangements in light of the Duke's continued incapacitation. This was, technically, not untrue. Reginald received his invitation at breakfast and read it twice with the careful attention of a man checking for traps, found none, and spent the remainder of the morning in the billiard room with the Northumberland brothers, in what Mary, passing the door with a coal scuttle, recognized as a planning session rather than a social one. The forged documents disappeared from the study drawer on Friday evening. Mary had expected this. She had also, on the Thursday afternoon while the house was occupied with receiving Mr. Carthew, taken the precaution of making a careful written record of everything the documents contained, every figure, every false seal, every detail she could commit to paper, and had given this record to Fenwick for safekeeping. The removal of the originals was Reginald's attempt to control what entered the room on Saturday. He was not the only one who had been making preparations. The grand drawing room at Ashcombe Manor had not been used in its full capacity since the summer, when the Duke had hosted a dinner for the county's landowners. It was a long, high-ceilinged room, with tall windows overlooking the frost-hardened gardens, furnished with chairs enough to seat 30 and a fireplace large enough to heat it adequately, even in December. By 10:30 on Saturday morning, it held, in addition to the furniture, 12 people whose collective tension was nearly visible. Reginald sat near the center, with the Northumberland brothers flanking him, and the Edinburgh cousin slightly to his left. The widowed aunt from Bath occupied a chair near the fireplace with her lapdog and an expression of anticipatory sorrow. Mr. Carthew sat to one side, with his document case on his knees. The 2 magistrates, landowners named Holt Pierce and Davenport, occupied chairs near the window with the alert neutrality of men who have been told enough to know they are present for a reason, but not enough to know what it is. The Duchess sat alone near the door, dressed in black, her hands folded, her face showing nothing. Mary stood at the sideboard near the far wall, where a parlour maid might reasonably be expected to stand, available if refreshments were required, invisible if they were not. Reginald opened proceedings with the smooth confidence of a man delivering a performance he has rehearsed thoroughly. He expressed sorrow. He expressed concern. He raised the question of the estate's management in the Duke's continued absence with the careful language of someone who has had legal advice on exactly how to phrase things. Then, at a nod from him, Goss, his manservant, seated near the door, produced a leather folder and brought it to the table. Inside the folder were the forged documents. Mary had wondered how he would manage this, given that the originals had come from the Duke's own study. Reginald had solved the problem by having them recopied. They were not the same papers she had read by candlelight in the cold study, but they said the same things, and they bore the same false seals. And to anyone in that room who had not memorized their contents 3 weeks earlier, they were entirely convincing. Reginald placed them on the table before Mr. Carthew and began to speak about the estate's debt position and the Duchess's management thereof, and the room was very quiet, and Eleanor sat with her hands folded and her face still, and Mary watched her and thought that the Duchess had spent her entire marriage learning to absorb things quietly, and that this was perhaps the hardest thing she had yet been asked to absorb. The door opened. It did not open dramatically. There was no flourish, no announcement. It simply opened, the way doors open when someone turns a handle and walks through, and the Duke of Ashcombe came into his own drawing room, dressed in a dark wool morning coat, his cravat properly tied, his color somewhat reduced from what it had been 6 weeks ago, but his bearing entirely, unmistakably his own. The silence that followed was of a quality Mary had never experienced in a room before, and suspected she never would again. Reginald's hand, still resting on the forged documents, did not move. His face did not move. He had the look of a man whose mind is working very rapidly, while the rest of him has temporarily ceased to function. The Duke walked to the head of the table and stood there and looked at the room with gray eyes that had spent 6 weeks learning exactly what each person in it was made of. "Good morning," he said. Mr. Carthew recovered first, because lawyers are trained to recover quickly. He opened his document case and produced Mary's written record of the forged papers, which Fenwick had delivered to him the previous evening, alongside a letter from Mr. Pemberton in London confirming in precise legal terms what the Duchess had arranged and at what personal cost. Reginald finally moved. He pushed back his chair. "I would remain seated," the Duke said quietly, "if I were you." Reginald Ashcombe did not remain seated for long. Within the hour, he had been formally confronted with Mary's written record, Mr. Pemberton's letter, and the testimony of Mr. Carthew, who had, it emerged, already been in quiet correspondence with Briggs the steward for the better part of a fortnight, following a discreet approach Briggs had made after Reginald's inquiries about the tenant ledgers. The Northumberland brothers, faced with the magistrates Holt, Pierce, and Davenport asking pointed questions about their involvement in the preparation of false legal documents, discovered simultaneously that their connection to the conspiracy was considerably more difficult to deny than they had imagined, and considerably less worth defending than they had supposed. The Edinburgh cousin quietly moved his chair away from Reginald's during the proceedings, which fooled nobody, but was noted with some amusement by Davenport, who had known the man's father and found the son a poor imitation. Goss, the sharp-faced manservant, said nothing at all, which was the smartest thing anyone on Reginald's side of the room did that morning. By noon, it was over. Not in the dramatic sense of courts and constables. That would come later, through the proper channels, with Mr. Carthew handling the legal particulars in the measured, unhurried way that serious men handle serious matters. But the conspiracy itself collapsed the moment the Duke walked through the door, because conspiracies of that particular kind depend entirely on the absence of the person they are built around, and Edmund Ashcombe was comprehensively present. Reginald left Ashcombe Manor that afternoon with his trunks and his manservant, and without a word to anyone, which the household received as confession enough. The Northumberland brothers departed the following morning. The Edinburgh cousin stayed another 2 days, apparently hoping that the atmosphere might improve, and then left when it became clear that it would not improve for him specifically. The widowed aunt from Bath remained for a week because nobody had the energy to address her directly, and she eventually departed of her own accord, taking her lapdog and leaving behind a brief note expressing hope that the family would recover from its recent difficulties, by which she appeared to mean the Duke's inconvenient survival rather than the conspiracy against him. Peace returned to Ashcombe Manor by degrees, the way warmth returns to a cold room, slowly at first, and then all at once. The Duke spent the first days of his recovery in carefully managed conversations that he had been postponing for 6 weeks. The first and most important of these took place in the Duchess's private sitting room on the Tuesday following the gathering, with no one else present and the door closed. Mary, passing in the corridor with fresh linen, heard nothing from within, and considered that a good sign. Raised voices would have meant the conversation was going badly. Silence meant it was going the only way it could go, between two people who understood each other well enough to know when words were insufficient. Eleanor did not make it easy for him, which was correct. She listened to his explanation with the stillness that Mary had long since understood was not coldness, but its precise opposite. And when he finished, she was quiet for a long time before she spoke. What she said, Mary did not know and did not need to. The Duke emerged from that sitting room 2 hours later, looking like a man who has been taken apart and reassembled, which is generally what genuine apology does to a person. He was more careful after that, more present. He visited his tenants in the first week of December, riding out in the cold morning air to the eastern farms where families had spent the autumn uncertain whether their homes were secure, and he told them directly and without elaborate explanation that the estate was sound and their leases were safe. He did not mention the Duchess's role in making that true, because Eleanor had asked him not to, and he had learned enough in the past 6 weeks to understand that honoring small requests is how trust is rebuilt after it has been broken. The household settled, the servants, freed from the peculiar strain of living inside a conspiracy they had only half understood, returned to their ordinary rhythms with visible relief. Mrs. Holt produced a series of increasingly elaborate dinners as her own form of celebration. Briggs the steward submitted a comprehensive account of every irregular approach Reginald's people had made to the estate office, which Mr. Carthew received with professional satisfaction. And Mary was called to the Duke's study on a Friday morning in the second week of December. She stood before his desk in her plain wool dress, with her hands folded, which was how she had stood before authority since she was 14 years old. And the Duke looked at her across the mahogany surface with the gray eyes that had watched her from beneath closed lids on the third evening of his performance, and knew, even then, that she had seen through him. "Mrs. Holt is retiring at Christmas," he said. "I am told you know this house better than anyone in it." Mary said nothing, because there was nothing to say that was not already understood between them. "The position of housekeeper," the Duke said, "requires someone with discretion, good judgment, and the particular ability to see what is actually happening in a room, rather than what people wish to be seen." He paused. "I believe you have demonstrated all three." Outside the study window, the manor gardens lay under a thin December frost, pale and still and quiet. Somewhere beyond the ha-ha wall, the eastern farms sat solid and unchanged in the winter fields, their tenants going about the ordinary work of an ordinary day, entirely unaware of how close things had come. Mary looked at the Duke across the desk and thought about the long, strange weeks that had brought them both to this particular Friday morning. The pretense, the forged papers, the thin wall in Westminster, the note pressed into Tom Hatch's hand in a lamplit corridor. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said. It was, all things considered, an understatement.